Chelsea Clinton is the vice chair of the Clinton Foundation. You can find her also teaching at Columbia University's Millman School of Public Health. And she's written several books for young readers, which we love here in the Children's Department of Politics and Prose, including the best-selling She Persisted series. She is the co-founder of Hidden Light Productions, a global entertainment studio. For today's event, you can ask our guests a question by clicking on the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You can also vote on your favorite questions by clicking the thumbs up button to push them up in the queue. And one last note, if you'd like to purchase your own copy of Debating Darcy, we're going to put a link in the chat that takes you to our website. You can purchase your own copy or come by the store. We'd love to see you. All right, Sayantani and Chelsea, I am going to turn this over to you.
Randy, thank you so much. And I hope that our audience will ask questions. I certainly am very grateful to have the chance to kick us off, but I certainly hope that I will not be alone in asking questions. I also apologize for my voice. As I was sharing with Sayantani earlier, I gave a eulogy this morning for a very close friend who passed away a couple of days ago. And so I'm a bit hoarse and quite sad by that personal loss and by the terrible tragedy in Texas, the far too common tragedy of gun violence in our country and the burden that it falls on so heavily for families and children. I also am able to be grateful for the chance to be in conversation with my friend and She Persisted colleague, Sayantani, with her really wonderful book, Debating Darcy. I don't think you need to be an Austen fan to appreciate it, but I think those of us who are Austen fans will find particular appreciation for it. And I think, Sayantani, that is just kind of the inevitable place we have to start. Do you remember kind of when you first read a Jane Austen novel? Was it Pride and Prejudice? What do you remember kind of either from Pride and Prejudice or whatever Austen book you may have first picked up and I have no doubt finished?
Thank you so much, Chelsea, for being here today. Thank you, Politics and Prose, for having us. And thank you, all of you in our virtual audience who are here. Before I answer your wonderful question about, and of course, Chelsea, of course it was Pride and Prejudice I read first.
It was for me too. It was
right.
For me.
Do you even have to ask?
Well, I don't know. Yes, because every once in a while I meet people who read Persuasion first or something.
Which is shocking, and we can talk about how shocking that is. But I just want to acknowledge my appreciation for you being here today on a personally difficult day, and of course, a nationally difficult day for all of us. We actually, I just want to share with the audience, had a conversation, do we move forward with the event with everything happening in Texas today, and happening so unfortunately often, right? Again and again. And I just want to acknowledge that, in my day job, both you and I, Chelsea, work at Columbia, and my job happens to be in a field called narrative medicine. And so I spend a lot of my days thinking about the importance of story in moments of trauma or tragedy or crisis, and the importance of kind of witnessing one another's stories and being in community with one another at moments of rupture. And so I just want to say how grateful I am to be in community with you today and in community with all of you here in the audience as we talk about story, yes, but we also talk about the importance of kind of raising your voice, which this book is also about, the importance of kind of speaking in community about the things that matter to you. And so I hope after our discussion today about a book that is about joy, but that's also about kind of speaking out and doing what's right, that we leave this evening hopefully a little bit more nourished and a little bit more energized to not just speak out, but also do the work that needs to get done, right? To take care of ourselves today and do the work that we need to do tomorrow. So I just want to kind of put that out there before answering your wonderful question, Chelsea, which was about Here, let me see. I can never figure out how to hold the book right, when I have the virtual thing up. The question you asked was about my first read, and it was not my apologies to all of you who read Jane Austen's Persuasion first, but like, of course it was Pride and Prejudice. And I was on a long summer vacation to India, and my grandfather had these 3 rows deep of novels to read. But most of them were, I was 12 or 13, and most of them were Russian novels, and they were very big and intimidating, and I didn't know what to do with them. He didn't have a lot of young people's literature. And my mom handed me this copy of Pride. It's very rumpled. You can't see, I think, the degree of rumpledness. I've dropped it in the bathtub several times as a teenager. Like, it's a mess, this copy. But this copy of Pride and Prejudice, and said, I think you'll enjoy this. And I was really intimidated by the title. I thought it was going to be a kind of didactic book about don't be prideful and don't be prejudiced, both of which are important lessons. But that's, of course, not what this book is about. It's an insightful, comedy of manners. It's about a family of sisters. It's about love. It's about self-actualization. It's about class. It's about many, many things. And so, because I was bored and on summer vacation, I didn't want to reveal to my mother that I read it, but I read it. I took her recommendation and I read it. And then for months, didn't tell her how much I loved it until the second time I began to read it. Like, the second time I took the copy back with me to America, and the second time I read it, she caught me. She was like, "Oh, so you really like the book, huh?"
Wait, why didn't you tell her though?
Because I didn't want her to be right that I would really love it.
Oh, okay.
I was at that like 12, 13-year-old age where I was like, no, I'm not going to read it just because you recommended it. And of course she was 100% right. And, the love affair I've had with this novel and its every derivation has begun since that day. So she was right.
Yeah,
Trust your mom is the lesson.
Well, as a mom, I will certainly endorse that. I have read Pride and Prejudice probably more than any other book. I can't think of any book that I've read as often. I am, though, so curious, kind of when you were on your second reading or your third reading, did you have a thought, even as a teenager, one day, maybe this will inspire me in a more direct way, not just with sort of life lessons or things to think about throughout life, but actually maybe I will kind of do something very directly inspired by this book? And then did it just sort of gestate for many years, or did this idea come to you more recently?
The idea definitely came to me as an adult to work on a reimagining. But I think the reason I'm so delighted to be in conversation with you is that from our brief discussions in other settings, when we were on panels for your She Persisted series, I wrote a little biography. Again, I'm not holding it correctly.
Of Virginia Apgar, for those of you who can't see it.
Yes, for those of you who can't see it. And we happened to begin talking about Pride and Prejudice. I know that you might feel the same way. When I was younger, this is one of those books that became like a building block of my personality. When you read something at that 12, 13, 14-year-old age, or even younger, even 8, 9, 10, those books that you read at those formative ages, they become like a scaffolding of your psyche. And Pride and Prejudice was one of those books. It became just a part of me to the extent that, of course, I was going to watch every film version umpteen number of times. And of course, I was going to see every theatrical production, whatever, and read it over and over again. But I had the idea to do a reimagining probably when, between 5 and 10 years ago, when I really started to write for young people, when I really, started my career as a children's and YA writer. But I was scared. I thought, I want to do a reimagining of my absolute favorite book by my absolute favorite author. And I am terrified of doing it an injustice, right? I'm terrified of not doing it right. how can I be as funny or witty or insightful as this brilliant author that I love, Jane Austen? How can I modernize, make it contemporary, maybe see through to fruition some of the issues that Jane Austen addresses, but can't see through to fruition in 1813, like the fate of the terrible Mr. Wickham, who she kind of gives a little bit of a pass to. How can I do those things and still do her justice? So it wasn't when I was a teenager, but probably for the last 5-10 years, I've been ruminating on this exact plot. And the reason I've been ruminating on it is I thought, I asked myself, well, what's the heart of Pride and Prejudice? Why do I love it so much? Yes, it's a book about romance, but it's also a book about wit. And it's a book about two, really clever, insightful people who debate their way into falling in love. And having been a speech and debate competitor in high school, I thought, well, wouldn't that be the perfect context to write this in? And so I had it in the back of my mind, but honestly, I've just been terrified. And then that really difficult, speaking of difficult times, that difficult winter of 2020, before vaccines came out, we were all very isolated. It was very cold. I remember that winter. I ended up, I started to write Debating Darcy because it was the book that I needed to read at the time. And so I ended up writing it almost to comfort myself, in this very difficult time. Like, again, we need stories, right, at difficult times. And that's how, so I just kind of got over my fear. And by the time I remembered to be afraid, I was already too far into writing it. So I just had to finish.
And Sayantani, you include some chunks of the original dialogue in the book, and then clearly kind of make more contemporary other kind of bits of dialogue. And as you said, kind of further draw out some of the kind of plot lines that feel a bit kind of unfinished and dangling, in even kind of her great work of Pride and Prejudice. How did you make those different decisions of kind of what dialogue to kind of honor in its original form, what dialogue to honor by ensuring audiences today could understand it, and kind of your experience, as a reader, kind of honoring that with answering the questions you still had? How did you kind of navigate all of those different choices as a writer?
Well, can I ask you a question, Chelsea? Are there parts of Pride and Prejudice that you had, because I'm imagining I know the answer to this, but I just want to ask, are there parts of it that you don't even realize that you have memorized, but you have memorized because you've read it so often?
Sure. Oh, for sure. For sure. I also am not too proud to admit that I see Jennifer L. and Colin Firth, like, reading them in my head or saying them, or like whatever the right vernacular is. No offense to all the other many wonderful adaptations that I've also seen, made over kind of the many decades before and after that one. But
no, you and I are, I think, one on
yes,
this issue.
Yes,
1995 BBC.
We are
all
one.
The way.
Yes, we are one.
We are united.
Yes. So yes, memorized, and yes, not even ashamed to admit memorized in their kind of accent and cadence.
Do you have a favorite line?
Do I have a favorite line?
I don't want to put you on the spot. You can.
No. I mean, I do think there is something about opening lines. I mean, I feel like it is, which is a narrator's line and not, but I do think there is something about the truth universally acknowledged, because isn't that always kind of one of the challenges for every generation, is to kind of break through what those often are, which are maybe not the most socially progressive social mores. And then I do think, I mean, just everything around, like the letter or the piano playing. I mean, all our pianoforte, like all of it is so wonderful. But I do think, if I think about the lines that have stayed with me, whether from kind of the great works of, the 19th century or kind of more contemporary works, like I went through a big Western phase and read all the big Western books. Like if I think about the first, oh my gosh. Thank you, Jackie Newmeyer. I'm sure you're not listening to this, but Jackie Newmeyer, one of my friends from high school, one day told me I had to read lonesome dove, and thus I like tumbled into a summer of reading endless pages about chaparral and windswept plains and taking care of a horse and all sorts of actually wonderful things. Anyway,
I love that.
Also has a very memorable first line. So I think there is something about the first line, but I think the first line in Pride and Prejudice is so memorable because it's a challenge to us about what really should be universally acknowledged and so often isn't, and what often is and so often shouldn't be.
Oh, I love that. I actually, now I wish I had been talking to you while I was writing it, because I don't, there are other, issues that I address that we can talk about, in terms of the kind of Me Too moment in the book. Terrible Mr. Wickham, who's like even in the original novel, like this character in his 20s or 30s, perhaps, who consistently kind of chases, is inappropriate with 15, 16-year-old young women. So that was an issue I knew I wanted to get to, but I love your read of that first line, Chelsea. I wish I had done something like that, asked myself, well, what are social truths that are universally acknowledged and, shouldn't be, and vice versa? Because I used the line at the head of not chapter 1, but chapter 2 of Debating Darcy. And I used it just to set up kind of the world of high school speech and debate. I said, it's a truth universally acknowledged that there are two kinds of people in high school forensics: speakers and debaters. And then I go on and, talk about speech competitors who are basically competitive actors, which is, I did speech competition in high school. And then I say debaters of all genders, on the other hand, are the mansplainers of the forensics world. What speech competitors are to nuance and emotions, debaters are to speed talking, ham-fisted point grabbing. No offense, debaters in the audience. This is simply my character Leela's initial first impression of who debaters are. And she does actually enter debate later in the plot, and she changes her mind. But certainly there's so many favorite lines, I, like you, have from the text, that I just threw them in willy-nilly, honestly. So one character says to another, he is cute. I give you leave to like him. You've liked many a stupider fellow. And so those are, lines from the original. And the reason that I felt, the characters in my novel are modern, multicultural high schoolers, right? Leela Bose, who you see behind me, is a public school, 11th grader. She goes to Longbourn High. Firoze Darcy, let me see if I can show him. Firoze Darcy is a debate competitor and a senior. He goes to the kind of more elitist Netherfield Academy. But again, these are young people who are speaking modern language. But the reason I felt comfortable throwing
and was Netherfield also a reference?
Of course.
Okay, great. Yeah,
of course. Longbourn, Netherfield, it's all a reference.
So it wasn't just the dialogue, it was also the places.
Of course, it's the places.
Do you have any idea how many direct references there are in the book? And do you have competition for people who can maybe find all, 213 or however many there are?
No, but yet again, I regret not consulting you prior to writing this book, because I don't have an exact number. I should. It's like 1 billion zillion references, because I'm that much of a Pride and Prejudice nerd. And yes, we should have a competition.
Right?
That is a genius suggestion. Yes, we should absolutely have a competition to find all the Easter eggs. Like, there's a moment where the Mr. Collins character, who's named Colin Kang, is eating dumplings. And that's such an obtuse, obscure reference to the Mr. Collins character in the film, talking about boiled potatoes. These are lovely boiled potatoes. And there's a moment where the character's eating dumplings. And I'm like, of course, everyone will understand these dumplings are akin to boiled potatoes. So yeah, there are a million moments like that. But I was going to say that I felt comfortable throwing a lot of Austen dialogue in, mostly because the Venn diagram of people who were involved in musical theater in my high school and involved in kind of speech competitions. It was like a perfect circle. Like we were all both involved in musical theater and we were constantly trying to out flamboyant each other, my group of friends, standing on tables and singing and so I could imagine a team like that saying things like, "You've liked many a stupider fellow, I give you leave to like him." Like, you know, it worked for me in my memory of what high school had been like, for sure.
More than fair. We have so many questions from the audience. And so while I also have questions, I want to be respectful of all the questions that have already been submitted, and then may return to a couple more of mine toward the end of our time together. So from Anne, Sayantani, did you find using a source to inspire your own novel freeing or constraining? Did you ever find Pride and Prejudice getting in your way? And then she says she's loving Debating Darcy. Thank you for writing it.
Oh, thank you, Anne. I think it would be different if I didn't love Pride and Prejudice so. It only got in my way in terms of I was afraid of not doing it justice. And I was because I kept pretty strictly to the plot of Pride and Prejudice, what I did was I reimagined all of the balls, all of the dances as high school speech and debate tournaments. And so in the original, Lizzie and Darcy meet at each of these kind of country dances or private dances. And in my book, Leela and Firoze meet at these speech and debate tournaments. And so I was keeping to that rhythm. And it was only at the last third of the book when I knew I wanted to stray from Austen. I knew I wanted to give that terrible cad, Mr. Wickham, his comeuppance, that I had to pause for a minute and think, okay, how do I do this in a way that's still consistent with the Austen that I love, you know, the Austen that I as a reader want to honor. And so I folded kind of that Me Too moment into a moment of community coming together, of the young women in the book kind of finding their voice and speaking up together. And so even though I stray from the plot, I felt like in my heart, I was still being consistent to the original. I had a moment to kind of pull back and think, but it didn't constrain me. What constrained me was all those years that I didn't write this book because I was too afraid.
And we have a couple of questions from Misa and Elizabeth around kind of how is the experience kind of writing for young adults different than writing for middle grade readers? And also how is the experience writing kind of this type of fiction different from writing kind of fantasy novels or biographies? So just how is this different than what you've done before?
Certainly I've been writing biographies and then middle grade fantasy prior to this. But interestingly, my middle grade fantasy series, the Kiranmala series, and then Force of Fire, Crown of Flames, which is coming up, are also inspired by, they're inspired by books. They're loosely inspired by Bengali folktales, which I heard when I was growing up. And so in a sense, as a writer, the gesture felt similar. I was tapping into kind of a cadre of stories that I loved in the middle grade books and making them my own. And in the YA, I was kind of tapping into a novel that I loved and trying to make it my own. So that gesture felt similar. The two things that were very hard about switching from middle grade to YA are as follows. One, cell phones. So my middle grade novels don't have any, they're fantasy novels, they're middle grade students, you know, it's a 12-year-old protagonist, they don't have cell phones. I certainly did not have a cell phone when I was in school by any stretch of the imagination. In Debating Darcy, I wanted to make it realistic. I wanted the young people to talk the way that young people talk. And so there were several texting kind of interchanges. And, you know, Chelsea, I don't know if you know that I have teenagers, you know, I'm a parent of teenagers, and they gave me a really hard time. They were like, Mom, these passages sound like someone's mom texting. And I was like, I am someone's mom texting. And they were like, well, but it
That's
should
not
sound
what it's supposed to be. Yeah.
right. There are too many capitals, too much punctuation. Like they corrected me. They gave me a very hard time. And then the second thing from going from middle grade to YA that also my children gave me an extremely hard time about was the kissing. Kissing was hard because they're 19 and 17. So, they're older teenagers. And they were like, where's the kissing? And I was like, well, there's longing looks. I was like trying to argue with them that.
But you definitely, there's a little bit of heat in your book.
Only because my teenagers shamed me into it. Just wait till your own kids are old enough to shame you into something like that. They were like, no, we want, a proper chapter with proper heat. And so there you go. I'm that mom that got shamed into writing the kissing scene.
But also probably gained you more credibility with your audience.
And honestly, it's my favorite chapter. It's one of my favorite chapters. All jokes aside, family, people you trust, people who love you are wonderful when they read your writing, in that they make you do the thing that's scary, right? And so this was a chapter that I was kind of shying away from, I was scared of. And even though they're my children, they did something that every good, kind of critique partner does, which is they make you do the thing that's scary. So my kids did that for me.
And admittedly, now a question for me, do you think it'll be challenging to then go back to a younger audience and realize you are back in a world without cell phones, or no, you're not concerned about that?
I happen to have been, I have a couple of books on the burner simultaneously. And so I have been writing middle grade, even as I've been writing both Debating Darcy and the next kind of YA that I have coming up. And because I've been doing it simultaneously, it's been really fun. For me, everything is very voice driven. I write in the I voice mostly. And so if I can find the character's voice, then I don't get lost, because I know, I ask myself, would this character do this thing? Would this character have said this thing? And I think that's what's kept me on track. And also, of course, fantasy versus contemporary is very different in tone. And so that's kept me on track as well.
And Sayantani, you may feel like you've already answered this, but from Neha, what's the most challenging part about adapting an Austen novel for a modern audience?
Well, I think, Neha, maybe I've said a couple of things before, but the one thing I wanted to make sure I did was, I wrote this novel for super fans of Jane Austen, like Chelsea and myself, admittedly, right? It was that an I admit, yeah. But I also wanted it to be delightful and accessible for someone who doesn't like Jane Austen, or maybe a young person who's never heard of Jane Austen. I wanted this still to be a story that had legs, that still could stand up and be enjoyed by somebody who loved Austen and was looking for all the 1 million zillion Easter eggs, and somebody who didn't know a thing about Austen, but still was drawn to a story about finding your voice, standing in community, doing what's right, even when it's hard. And so that was hard. That I to strike that balance when you're doing an adaptation between super fans and people who may not know Austen at all. I wanted to be very conscious of that. So that was a tricky move.
And Sayantani, admittedly, this is now my question too. I'm so curious about the title, like whether or not, just as soon as you were thinking about this book 5 years ago, you knew that it would be titled Debating Darcy, or did you kind of experiment with different titles, maybe a couple that were kind of more or closer to Pride and Prejudice, or something and something else? Or I'm just curious kind of what you can share about the thought around the title. Thinking around the title.
It's interesting. I happen to I have a book I'm writing right now. The title of the book is not The Horsey Book, but I've been calling it just off the cuff, The Horsey Book. Like I've just been saying that. It's a book about flying horses. It's called Secrets of the Sky. The series is called Secrets of the Sky. It's not called The Horsey Book. But, in my head, I just have little nicknames for books. It happens to be, I was calling this book Debating Darcy from the beginning.
Oh, wow.
And then thought, I have a brilliant, brilliant editor, Abby McAdden at Scholastic. And I thought, Abby will fix it. We'll find a different title if that's not the right title. And we did. Abby and I went through Pride versus Persistence. We went through a number of titles. And Debating Darcy kind of stuck. It felt like it did the work, it told us everything we needed to know. It was about debate. It was a Pride and Prejudice reference. But certainly it was just my shorthand way of referring to the book, kind of like saying the horsey book. But this time it actually was the right title and it stuck. And sometimes that happens. Like sometimes, simple is good. Like it does the work it needs to do and it worked. But I didn't think it was going to be the title. I was entirely depending, again, on Abby, my brilliant editor, to put me to rights. And this was the title that worked.
And since we're just talking about naming, how did you name your main characters? I mean, how did you decide, Leela would be Leela and Firoze would be Firoze, and also the other characters' names that are sometimes quite close and sometimes a little further away from the characters' names in the original Austen novel? How did you kind of decide kind of what to name whom in your book?
That's a great question. So as somebody with, a very unique in a US context sounding name, I know the importance of names. Names are really important. Lizzie Bennet, I knew that, everyone's last name couldn't be the same because in the original novel, they're sisters. And in my novel, it's kind of a chosen family. Her speech and debate team is her chosen family. Just like anybody's sports team or, theater group becomes their chosen family. So I knew that was one thing. So I wanted to give her a Bengali name that had L and B in it. So Leela Bose ended up being the name. I knew I wanted to keep Darcy. So how do I do that? So Leela Bose is Indian, Bengali, Hindu American, which is kind of my own background. Firoze Darcy is both Pakistani American and British, which is why his last name is Darcy, and Muslim. And so even though it's not a major factor in the book, I also knew that along with the kind of class conflict that's, consistent with the original, I wanted to kind of bring in that subcontinental flair of, what if this is actually an interfaith relationship, a Hindu-Muslim relationship? Not that it's a major factor of the book, it's just a happenstance, but I knew I wanted to bring that in. And so he became Firoze Darcy, Fitzwilliam Darcy, right? Firoze Darcy. Most of the other characters were keeping their original names. Mr. Collins became Colin Kang. I knew, I wanted a kind of multicultural cast of characters, just like modern day high schools are. The one name that ended up really changing was there were a lot of C's in Pride and Prejudice. And there's Charles Bingley, Caroline Bingley.
Oh, yeah.
Charlotte Lucas, Mr. Collins, so Colin King. There was just a lot of C's.
I've never been attentive to that, but yes.
Me neither. But when when you write certainly a contemporary novel, your editors will often say, hey, just for clarity's sake, you might want to pay attention to how many same first letter characters you have. And when that was happening, Caroline Bingley became Roe, that became a nickname. And then I thought, well, Charlotte Lucas is Nigerian American and African American, and I wanted to maybe give her different first name than Charlotte. And so I ended up asking permission of someone I know, a wonderful young woman named Oluwa Thomason, if I could use her name, and she became Oluwa Thomason Lucas, Tomi Lucas. So that's how it happened, but it was all because of too many C's. Is where that
I don't know what I thought your answer was going to be to my question, which again, I think you would only be attentive to if you've read the book so many times that you're like, oh, this is the same name. This is a little different. This one is wildly different. And now I know.
Too many C's. Chelsea Clinton.
Parents, come on. I think the next question, and there are so many, and I'm going to try to get through all of them, and I apologize if I don't, but I am trying. From Aloe, thank you for your work to increase cultural diversity in YA literature. How have your South Asian cultural sensibilities influenced this work?
Lovely question. Well, certainly I think all of us deserve to see ourselves as heroes. All of us deserve to see ourselves centered and as protagonists. And I I was a young woman who's an immigrant daughter who loved Pride and Prejudice, who loved Jane Eyre, who loved, many, many novels that didn't include people who looked like me. Now, the question is always an interesting one to me. Do we take these stories that don't include people who look like us, don't include brown and black faces, and we put ourselves in these stories, right? That's the Hamilton question. Do we say, hey, American history belongs to all of us, so we're going to recast what the founding fathers, the founders looked like? Or do we say, you know what, to do that is actually to let people off the hook. It's to not look at the impact of, the British Raj in India, which happened shortly after Austen, but it's not to, it's to let the East India Trading Company off the hook. It's to let histories of colonialism that seep into Austen's work off the hook, or it's to let, Jefferson off the hook, or, it's to say, hey, Thomas Jefferson couldn't, have done terrible things.
Sayantani, I adore you, but we cannot put Jane Austen in the same sentence with Thomas Jefferson.
No, I agree. No, okay. But here, let me finish the sentence. Okay. But we can't criticize him.
She doesn't deserve that. She doesn't.
No, she doesn't. But, because he can rap well, the guy who plays him can rap, So to me, that's a kind of post-colonial descendant sensibility. It's to say, what do we do? Do we insert ourselves into these stories? Do we not? Can we do so and still critique them? And so Hamilton ends up playing a big role in the story. And that's why, because I don't have an answer. My characters actually debate about it in the book. I have two brown characters in a book inspired by Jane Austen, arguing about whether or not we should put brown characters in books like by Jane Austen. And they end up arguing about Hamilton, is the way that they do it. But I don't have an answer to that, but that's what I grappled with a lot in the book. Is what do we do? And maybe we do both. Maybe we grapple.
We grapple. Oh my goodness, so many questions. Another question from Neha, but it's gotten so many upvotes. I want to ask it. So Sayantani, do you have any writing advice you could share for aspiring writers who are extremely nervous about the daunting publishing process?
Maybe both of us can answer this.
Yeah, sure.
Keep going. The world needs your stories. Toni Morrison says, if there's a book you want to read and it hasn't been written yet, you must write it. And I never contradict Toni Morrison because she knows everything.
Yes, I agree. I try to write every day. I don't make it every day, but I try to write every day, even if it's just, an idea or my feelings about something that has maybe happened in our family or, my neighborhood, my city, our country, our world. Because I find that forcing myself to put kind of words down every day helps me more quickly find the words that I'm looking for when I'm actually working on a project, whether it's, an op-ed or a lecture or a book. So that's my advice. I have to ask this question from May because I think you will particularly appreciate it, Sayantani. She says two things. One, my husband did debate in high school, and your description was just so spot on that I laughed out loud. And two, do you have plans to adapt any other Austen novels or other great novels of that era for modern audiences and multicultural inclusion?
In fact, next
breaking news.
Breaking news. It's not a sequel by any means. It's just the next YA I have coming out. It's called Rosewood, a midsummer meet cute. And it is Sense and Sensibility inspired, a little bit more loosely than this one is Pride and Prejudice inspired.
Is there a walk through the rain?
There is a walk through the rain, in fact.
Okay, good. All right, then I can read it.
Of course.
Well, I don't know. You just said loosely. I got very nervous for a moment.
Don't get nervous. The Jefferson Austen thing for you. So don't get nervous. Jefferson will not appear. Shakespeare is does appear though, not Shakespeare, the actual character, but.
But say, is there a ghost? Yeah.
No. You know, I play a little bit with Sense and Sensibility and The Taming of the Shrew, the two sisters and two sister stories. And then it's called A Midsummer Meet Cute because when I was growing up, and then as a mother, summertime outdoor Shakespeare was a really important part of my life, and then a part of my life as a mother. It's something that we just did a lot as a family. And so this is a novel that kind of captures that romp, frothy joy of that feeling of that firefly, like romantic feeling of being outdoors, watching the magic of theater. So it's a novel set in a Regency camp. And they're young aspiring actors who want to get cast in a multicultural Regency-inspired murder show. And they meet in this Regency camp. Yeah. So it's like Bridgerton meets Murder, She Wrote is the show, which is ridiculous, but it's the show that I've concocted.
And does someone die?
No one does. No one does, but everyone's vying to be like a Regency, murderess or corpse or something.
Everyone's dream. This is also a question that I think I know that you will have many, many thoughts to share on. Dr. Dasgupta, I'm curious about your thoughts on Austen and feminism. What do we gain or lose by using modern feminism as a lens to read Austen? Debating Darcy was described as a feminist retelling of Pride and Prejudice. Would you agree with that review? And if so, why do you think it's important to reimagine some of the sticky parts of Pride and Prejudice, such as the terrible Mr. Wickham you've already mentioned? What do we gain from altering these storylines for a more, if not positive, at least a more resolved end?
Well, I think as a reader, you always read through your modern and then identity-based sensibilities. It's inevitable, right? You can't not read from the position of who you are. And so, of course, I have always read Austen from the position of who I am and been dissatisfied, not with Austen, but with the plot, with the way that Mr. Wickham gets treated. Of course, in 1813, Jane Austen writes extremely critically of Mr. Wickham and what he's like and his behavior, but there isn't really a possibility of Lydia or a bunch of people standing up and condemning him for his behavior. He kind of basically gets a dowry and gets away with it, right? He gets away with his terrible behavior. And as a modern reader, that always was a sticky point for me. Again, interestingly, not with Austen, because I felt like she set us up to be able to see him very clearly by the end of the book. We hate him, as readers by the end of the book. We understand he's terrible. He just doesn't get his just desserts in the social milieu of the time. And so I think that when, anytime you're writing an adaptation, and if you're making it contemporary, it has to be consistent with what would happen in the social milieu of the time. And that's why the young women in this book kind of get to come together. They have kind of a Me Too moment where they speak their truths. And unfortunately, I didn't have to make it up. I was inspired by, young folks in high school who are using social media to kind of call out sexism and, racism and other kind of oppressive behaviors in their high schools and in their sports teams and their speech and debate teams. So I was actually kind of trying to pay homage to real young folks doing this work, telling their stories. And so, I did want to do that to the original Austen, but I also recognized that unfortunately I didn't have to make it up.
Sadly. I will say, listening to you answer that question reminded me of, Sayantani, have you ever seen the wonderful interview that Cornel West gave as part of the Morgan Library's
about Austen?
Edition? Right, yeah. Like a dozen years ago, probably. I think truly a dozen years ago. And I'll never forget, him talking about how, he appreciated Austen because, not only did she, create relationships that were remarkably well balanced at the time, where kind of women had more agency, but where kind of her characters were radical at the time, where, she was doing kind of at the edge of what she saw possible to expose injustices, whether as relates to race or class or gender. And so he said, yes, like he appreciated the comedy around manners, and he appreciated the love stories, but he really appreciated that she was such a radical for her time. And I've just always been struck by that, because I think I also felt that way when I was reading it as a child.
Oh, absolutely. And if folks haven't seen that Cornel West interview about Jane Austen, it's brilliant.
It is brilliant. And so I'm just mindful of time, and we continue to receive more questions. Did you have a hard time adapting Austen's irony to the modern idiom?
Oh, interesting. I tried hard. I tried hard to be witty. Yeah, I mean, I hope that readers appreciate that. Certainly, as much as this is a novel about love and romance, it's a novel about words and wit. And that's the heart that I tried to remain true to of Austen, is that wit, and is the way that, sentences become swords, right? People spar with their words. And I tried to be consistent with that. I did.
Well, and I think you do, and I sadly didn't put any bookmarks in, but I think you also do a very good job in the internal kind of dialogue and reflection, in being kind of sharp and witty, and you use kind of short declarative sentences, which Austen also does often. So I think to the person who asked the question, Sayantani does an excellent job. Becky, thank you for your insights in this interview. I love hearing your views. What advice do both of you ladies have for graduating senior students this year? So Sayantani, I'll let you answer it and then I'll chime in.
I'm not sure if it's graduating senior high school students or graduating senior college students. I happen to have a daughter who is graduating this year, high school.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's a really difficult time. COVID has, Arundhati Roy has this great article where she calls the pandemic a portal. And it's, we've become time travelers, like years have become minutes and days have become years. And there's been so much loss, personal loss of people, loss of milestones, loss of time in these moments. So I would just say to these graduating seniors, take care of yourselves and each other. And maybe actually where we began, which is, we can't do any of this alone. And, it's a wonderful time, celebrate it, but celebrate it in community. And similarly, when things are difficult, get support in community. Because I see, how much young people are struggling. And I want to both celebrate you, but also to say, take care of yourselves and take care of yourselves in community with one another, because that's the best. I think that's the best we can all do.
I completely agree. And the importance of being kind to one another and being kind to ourselves. I shared earlier that I was at a funeral today and was one of the people who gave a eulogy for a deeply loved friend. And one of the other people who spoke said, he thought there were three types of friends. There were the friends who supported you through the challenging times, but didn't celebrate you in the good times. The friends who celebrated you in the good times, but didn't support you in the hard times. And then the friends who supported you in the hard times and celebrated you in the good times. And so I would also urge you, as you journey forward in life, to find those friends, the friends who will kind of shoulder you when you need it, and be the loudest applause when you've earned it. So what is your least favorite Austen novel, Sayantani? Since you already answered your favorite, what is your least favorite?
Do I dare say?
I mean, feel free to take a pass. You've answered all. I think we've answered more than a dozen questions, so feel free.
I love them all. Maybe a little bit less Mansfield Park, but nobody be mad at me because I know people love Mansfield Park. How about you, Chelsea?
Northanger Abbey, it's just like Gothic is not my thing.
Oh, I kind of dig Northanger Abbey because it's so over the top.
So over the top.
I know.
Oh, it is. It's so all that drama, all that drama.
Yeah.
I just like, it's like super saturation. And I know that it is an excellent example of the Gothic genre. So also, please don't be mad at me, because I also know that there are many people who love that book. Okay. Here's a very specific question for you, Sayantani. My favorite, I think, adaptation of Austen is musical Bride and Prejudice. Is this something you saw and enjoyed?
I love Pride and Prejudice, and I love Gurinder Chadha, who, if you have not, folks out there, if you have not seen Bend It Like Beckham, that is the most genius film, that she did prior to Pride and Prejudice. So definitely see that as well. No, I love it. It's delightful and frothy, and Gurinder is also a diasporic daughter. So, she grew up in England. And so she took all of the kind of Bollywood tropes and intersected them with Jane Austen, just like in Rosewood, I'm taking Shakespeare and intersecting it with
Needless to
sense.
say, she did not cut out the dance scenes,
Yes.
Unlike Sayantani.
All about the dance scenes.
All about, they're amazing.
Yeah. Delightful, though. Delightful.
Yes. From Kiran, who or what are you reading now that you love?
Oh, I am reading, I'm actually reading Portrait of a Thief, which is a debut novel by Grace Lee, who is also has a medical background, but she's in medical school and wrote this wonderful kind of identity at Stanford Med School and wrote this wonderful.
Very impressive, Sayantani. Right? I'm very impressed when people write like fiction while they're working on their PhDs or they're in medical school. They're doing things that are not fiction, so shall we say, and then they're able to kind of stretch their brain in such different ways. I find it incredibly impressive.
Yeah, so she's wonderful. It's an Asian American kind of identity-based heist novel where a group of Chinese American young people are stealing back Chinese kind of art pieces, from the West.
I would read that.
Great, it's great.
And admittedly, I realized it was for both of us, and this is literally the last thing I read. Admittedly, I finished it on Friday.
Well, thank you.
From Alug Bimasola, Dr. Dasgupta, would you ever consider an adaptation / sequel to Pride and Prejudice or any Austen story? So I guess the question is, would you ever kind of continue to tell the stories of either the characters in this or your next book far beyond whatever Austen would have imagined?
Well, never say never. I think.
Ooh, that's intriguing. I like that answer.
Mostly because I don't have a more definitive answer, but I'm pretending to be mysterious.
Well, Sayantani, thank you so much. I know we're almost at time, and I'm incredibly grateful for your time and that you continue to share your kind of enormous and extensive talents with us in so many ways. And thank you to Politics and Prose and to everyone who tuned in tonight. With us here or on YouTube.
No, thank you so much, Chelsea. I'm incredibly grateful to you, to Politics and Prose, and to everyone who joined us this evening. And again, just to acknowledge that there's a lot going on in the world, and that I hope that being in community today was nourishing, and then it helps us kind of do the work that we need to do together tomorrow to make the world a better place for all of us.
Amen.
All right. On behalf of Politics and Prose, thank you to you both. I felt like it was just being part of a conversation with friends. It was just what we needed, or at least I needed. Thank you, viewers, for those excellent questions. You can still click on the link in the chat to purchase your own copy of Debating Darcy. We really appreciate your support. You can learn about other upcoming events in children and teens by going to our website, which is politics-prose.com. Just click on the Children and Teens tab and then Events, and you will see a calendar of all of our upcoming events, both virtual like this one, and we're starting to do some things in person as well. And you can also view past events on our YouTube channel. Thank you again, Sayantani and Chelsea. Thank you so much. We hope to see you both again soon.